This fight is one of the biggest fights you can make in the UFC right now, but it's not really been spoken about enough. So let's dive into it, because the fight between Israel Adesanya and Dricus Du Plessis has all the ingredients to be one of the best title fights we've ever seen. And I don't say that lightly, because before we jump into the X and O's, let me actually lay the table for some context behind this. To have a good fight and to have a big fight, you need to have a narrative. And best believe both of these fighters have a narrative, because we've of course seen before the very viral moments when Israel got in the cage with Dricus and called him some very un-PG words, let's say, and there was the whole dispute about who was the real African, and the fact that Israel left Africa and went to fight in New Zealand, and Dricus was of course on the side saying, I live and breathe and train in Africa, I am the real African champion. Now you can make your own mind up with what is correct or not correct about that. Ultimately, it doesn't matter. We have some good sound bites to run in UFC Embedded and also the countdown shows, and it adds some animosity on the line. And again, just to further the context of this fight, we have Israel potentially going on to do something that no one has ever done before, become a 3-time champion. Now that in itself is incredibly impressive, and I was sitting there thinking, I would argue that's more impressive than a long reigning champion. You think of the win streaks like Demetrius Johnson and like Anderson Silva, Kamaru Usman, or even Israel to a certain extent, all incredibly impressive in their own right. But when you think about fighters reaching the peak, very rarely do we see them drop off and go back there, because it's very difficult to do. The mindset required, physically, what is required of you to do that over 10 years in the UFC is almost impossible. So the fact that we're sitting here where Israel could potentially go and do that 3 times, we have to tip our hat off to him. So when we actually look at this fight, stylistically a very, very interesting one, because for Israel, this is one of the longest layoffs he's had. Now for most people, it isn't that long, it's just under a year. But for Israel, who almost carried the division and the UFC on his back for a very large portion of the last few years, this is a long hiatus, which is an interesting angle to this, because someone as cerebral and meticulous as Israel is likely going to go away, look at what didn't go well for him, really break that down and look to build off that. So the question coming into this fight is, what is that going to be? Now, I think that's going to be a couple of things, and we'll get into it in more depth in a second, but I think that's going to be coming into adding more wrinkles and also the game planning. Now, from Dricus' perspective, of course, he's captured the belt against Sean Strickland in a close fight, a competitive fight, but an impressive fight nonetheless. And Sean Strickland is never easy to fight because he's so unorthodox. And that is, of course, who Israel lost the belt to. So again, we're just developing and building off of that narrative. So there's so many different angles that the UFC can run with this. This is why it's a good title fight. And again, why it's a little bit weird that we've not necessarily had as much coverage of this fight that I believe it deserves. And that could be down to the fact maybe it's 12 months later than it should be. I think if this fight is 12 months ago, it's a lot bigger. But anyway, we are here now. So when I actually look at this fight from Israel's perspective, I think the adjustments he's going to have to make is him dictating the play. Now, this isn't going to be easy against Dricus because he is very bullish in his attacks. He's the one that likes to set the pace. He's the one that likes to blitz in, and he's the one that likes to be on the front foot. But when we saw Izzy in his most recent fight, he was on the back foot the entire time. Now, of course, this is almost entirely because of Sean Strickland. He was fighting at that suffocating style where he's just taking small steps into range, he's backing you up, and this was making Israel counter strike and strike moving laterally the entire fight. Now, these are very difficult skills to do as a striker. Not only is it very taxing on the conditioning to move backwards and to strike, but also to move laterally as well out of both stances it's very, very difficult. And you don't see a lot of people who can do it, at least do it well. Someone that comes to mind is Sean O'Malley. Does a fantastic job of floating backwards and punching, and also moving out of both stances left and right. Now, Israel can do this, but he won't want to do this for an entire fight. And again, Sean Strickland proved that he isn't going to be strongest there. So I really think the game plan element, like I mentioned earlier, is going to be more rigid in the fact he's going to look to take the centre of the octagon early and to dictate things on his terms. Now, I do think it's an important element to bring up that he has been working on that strength and conditioning. Now, usually when people put on a bit of size and they put on a bit of mass, the natural narrative is to suggest, are they going to be able to fight at the same pace? Are they going to be able to fight into the championship rounds? Now, I think we've seen enough from Izzy over his career to suggest that isn't going to be a problem. He's done it in his kickboxing career, and we've seen him go deep into 5 rounds many, many times. You think of the Kelvin Gastelum fight, he does have that last round conditioning. Now, I do think the pace will slow down just slightly because of the added muscle, but I don't think the conditioning is going to be much of a problem. But I do think he's going to look to set his stall out early and really dictate that pace, which again is going to be interesting because Dricus is never afraid about telling you his game plan. He wants to be the one that's coming forward. He wants to be the one that's getting in your face. And this is where it's going to be an interesting battle. Because typically what we see from Dricus is he does use that blitzing style. We do see him put combinations together. And I think something that he does, which Israel is slightly more refined at, is being able to counter strike, to be able to sit in the pocket, to bob out of shots, to weave out of shots, to slip shots, and then counter strike. Typically with Dricus, you'll see him either defend or attack. He doesn't usually have that transition phase in between, that sort of murky water, if you like. But we've seen Israel do that throughout his entire career. So if they do butt heads and clash in the middle, it's going to be really interesting to see the combination striking and the power of Dricus against the counter striking of Izzy, which is no secret where he does his best work. And when you look at recent performances, which even that he won, but maybe not the most exciting, people were always very critical because he would jab and calf kick his way to victories. Well, a lot of the times that's because his opponents didn't really want to engage. And it was a smart move on their behalf, to be perfectly honest, because if you engage with Izzy, you really put yourself at a lot of risk. But Dricus is most certainly going to engage. He is not going to be gun shy whatsoever. So yes, that's where he could have his success, but that could also be his downfall. Because what you will see in Dricus's fights is the fact that sometimes he does lead with his head and he does lead with his punches. Now, he does have tremendous power out of both stances. And when he goes forward and he goes with these blitzing attacks, you have to be respectful of what's coming at you because he's so heavy-handed. The knockout against Trevin Giles is one which always comes to mind. Again, that was a scenario where we saw him cover up, a bit like Izzy against Alex Pereira, to be perfectly honest. Cover up against the cage, Trevin Giles let go of his combinations, he stopped, then Dricus blitzed him with his attack, and he managed to knock him out without even his feet being planted. So that shows you the power that Dricus brings to the table. But then when you look at Israel in the pocket against people like Robert Whittaker, he has a phenomenal ability to be able to swerve on angles and to be able to cut angles in the pocket and to land killer shots with both hands. So that's where this fight's going to be quite interesting. Now, coming back to what I said with Israel in regards to adding wrinkles to his game, there's so much footage on Israel. There's so much tape to watch, and Dricus and his team are phenomenal at doing that. They're not just good fighters, they're phenomenal strategists. And that's exactly where they got the win, of course, through the actual finish itself. But the strategy behind the Robert Whittaker win was a large part down to that finish. They said that when they watched Robert Whittaker, there's not really many holes, and there isn't. But they saw multiple times he had difficulties against southpaw. And you can hear his corner ask him to go southpaw in the fight, of which he does. And that's when he lands that jab. And that was the beginning of the end for Robert Whittaker. So you know they're going to be doing their tape study. And you know there's a lot of tape on Israel. So he's going to have to do something different. Now, being this late in his career, and being this long in the tooth, you're not going to be able to reinvent the wheel. You're simply not going to be able to. And it's not going to be within your best interests to do that, because you're naturally going to lean on what you're best at and what you've done for a long time. So it's just going to be refining that slightly. So again, it comes back to the game plan and the strategy. I think he's going to look to take the center a lot earlier and establish his position. I also think we're going to see Israel level change. Now, I know that sounds a little bit crazy, and I know people are sitting here thinking that's never going to happen. I think we're going to see that. I don't think he's necessarily going to be looked to be running blast doubles and going double to single leg and run the pipe, get takedowns, establish position and look to set up submissions. I don't think that's how it's going to look. But I think he's smart enough to know he has to give different looks in his game now. He has to. So I think that's where we're going to see it. I think we're going to see Izzy show different levels, not only with his striking, because we always see that, but also with his takedowns. At least just try and get to the hips. Even if he's unsuccessful, even if he's nowhere near, he needs to give that look 100% against Dricus, because best believe he'll be doing the same thing. We've seen that against Sean Strickland, which is where Dricus is very strong, is the fight IQ. Because yes, he's a phenomenal striker. Yes, he doesn't always look very orthodox, but he's extremely effective. And we have to get out of this mindset of just looking at a fighter and thinking, not the prettiest, they're not the best. That isn't how fighting works, to be honest. It goes on effectiveness. And Dricus Du Plessis is extremely effective when it comes to the striking and the grappling. And where we saw him secure the takedowns with Sean Strickland, he wasn't able to do anything with them, barely establish position and not really get any ground and pound off, but he was stealing rounds. It's all about the optics, as you'll hear Eric Nixick say in the corner. It's all about the optics. And Dricus understands that. And he knows that this is not an easy fight against Israel. And yes, he may be able to get the finish, but he needs to get those rounds as well. So I think he's going to look to level change and establish some position, of course, with the ground and pound. But this is where he's going to use that fight IQ. I also think Israel's going to look to do the same, because that's the threat with Dricus. He does have submissions in his bag. And these two, interestingly enough, have actually trained together. They have sparred together and they have grappled together. This was just when Izzy came over from China, so he was new to the grappling, and he even admitted that Dricus was dominant there. So there's just another added layer into it. Now, I do think, for the most part, Israel's going to do a good enough job at staying safe. I think that he's got one of the best takedown defenses of all time. And I think it's very easy to use the narrative against Israel of just take him down. But that's not how it works. Again, using Sean O'Malley as a perfect example, people say that about Sean. But it's a very different task when you've got someone in front of you that's switching stances. He's giving you different feints at different levels, showing you uppercuts, showing you knees, and switching out of both stances, moving laterally. It's very hard to establish their position and then take your shot. So that's why this matchup is going to be very fascinating, because yes, Dricus Du Plessis is unorthodox, but the more orthodox striking of Israel is going to be hard to level change onto. And this is actually where I can see Israel getting a finish within the 3 rounds. Now, every time I think about this fight, and we'll come on to the paths to victory for Dricus in a second, but the paths to victory, I think, for Israel are going to be on the way that Dricus sometimes leads with his head in combinations and leaves his head on the center line, and also when he dips off with his striking. After he's thrown his shots, you'll see he dips off to an angle. And ever since this matchup was made, all I could have in my head was Derek Brunson versus Israel. That's all I could think of. Now, I'm not saying that Dricus is on par with Derek Brunson, but I'm saying their movement patterns are somewhat similar. So can I see a world in where he throws a big right hand and his head dips off to the left and Israel meets him with a knee or somewhat of a question mark kick? 100% I can see that. Because we talk about fight IQ for Dricus, we need to do the same with Izzy. And this man is a master at picking up reads. And if he just gets a little bit of a pattern, even just once, even just twice, that'll be banked. And if Dricus makes that mistake twice or 3 times, that could be the end to the fight. You can make those sort of mistakes, if you like, against a Sean Strickland, but he's not going to be able to capitalize on it like an Israel could, because he doesn't necessarily have that power and they have different styles. His MO is not always necessarily to sit on his shots and look for the killer blow, but Israel does have that ability. So I can see a way in which this does look like the Derek Brunson fight, and Israel's able to hurt him, not necessarily put him away, but hurt him, drop him, and finish the job. Now, on the flip side, when I look at this for Dricus, there's absolutely no way I'm discounting this man. Absolutely not. I watched him in his debut, and ever since 2 fights in, I said, I'm never betting against this man, because I made the mistake of thinking, oh, he doesn't look that orthodox, he's a bit herky-jerky, but no. He's effective. He's effective in the grappling, the striking, and the jiu-jitsu. He can finish the fight absolutely anywhere, and we've seen now that he has the cardio and the conditioning to go 5 rounds. And when you look at Dricus' career, he's been doing this at the highest level. People forget he was in the likes of KSW, which is a very, very legitimate promotion. So we know he can go a hard 5 rounds against the very elite. So this is why I think this could actually be a razor close fight. A razor close fight. And that's where I think the level changes and the established position on the ground from Dricus could pay dividends. Because I think we could be looking at a fight at the end of it where it's razor close and we say, okay, the ground control and a couple of elbows there from Dricus is where he's won that 3-2. I can see both scenarios. But how I'm going to wrap this up is when Israel's back against the wall, this man performs. It's as simple as that. And when history is on the line, this man performs. He's had a long time away to work on his game, to work on his mental, and to build back up that mystique that he has internally of the style bender. And given a big stage and a big platform in basically what's his home country in Australia, with a big narrative like Dricus, I really think this is the moment for him to shine. And I could play it safe going to decision, but I can see Israel getting the stoppage within 3 rounds. It's going to be hard to do against Dricus. He's a tough bastard and he's not easy to put away. But he has been put away before. And I think if anyone can do it in the middleweight division, it's Israel Adesanya. 3rd round, some stoppage via strikes. Let me know what you think in the comments. And as always, keep it casual.